Hi everybody, my name is Cliff Anderson, and I'm really glad to be teaching this course at Westminster Presbyterian Church on the Theology of Artificial Intelligence. This is a 4-week course, and we're going to learn lots of things starting from can machines think, to what are deep fakes and how are they changing our perceptions of reality, and where is this all leading the church. I really want to thank Guy Griffith for the invitation to teach this course with you. Obviously, I wish I could be with you in person, but I guess we're going to do it virtually, so let's just get started. Thanks. See you soon.
Great to have you with me. Today we're going to be talking about the imitation game. As you'll see, a common thread in what we're discussing today is that artificial intelligence tries to imitate human behavior, tries to behave as it expects a human would behave under the same circumstances. We'll see lots of examples of that, but before we go further, I'd like to talk about what we'll be covering in the next 4 weeks. After this week, we're going to move into something called deep fakes. That's the attempt to create synthetic videos that depict events using audio and video that never actually happened, or at least didn't happen the way they're portrayed. That's a scary application of artificial intelligence. We'll talk about the pros and cons of that particular type of artificial intelligence. And then we'll move on to the ethics of algorithms. Here we'll look at ethical questions raised by artificial intelligence, but also the increasing use of algorithms in society more broadly. In our last week, to sort of wrap it up with a discussion of can artificial intelligence promote religious ends? What's the role of artificial intelligence, if any, within the church? So with that in mind, let me just begin by sharing this quotation from Alan Turing. As we'll learn, Alan Turing was the founder of computer science, and in 1947 he wrote the following: "I believe that at the end of the century, the use of words in general educated opinion will have altered so much that one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted." So a question for you is, do you think we've reached that point already? Do people really think that machines can think? Or do we see this as very complex algorithms that deceive us into thinking that they're able to perceive but can't really think? So that's the question that we'll be investigating. I'll be interested in your opinion at the end of this. So just a little bit on Alan Turing. He wrote this paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence in Mind, which laid out a framework for judging whether machines can think. He was already famous by that point for having published on the foundations of computability in 1936. Computer science rests on the discoveries of Alan Turing. The Turing machine is still a fundamental idea in computer science. After the war, Turing began to think about what were some of the long-term implications of computability. As computers continue to grow in power, will they reach the point in which they can be said to be equivalent to human beings? This is the game he devised to explore that idea. He had the idea on the one hand that you'd have a computer in a room that could communicate with a human being only by passing messages back and forth. So you see here that there's a window and there's a message going through, and so the human doesn't know who's behind this wall. The job of this person is to determine which one is the computer and which one is the human. What Turing said was, if computers could reliably deceive humans into thinking that they were communicating with a human, then we would be able to say that that computer was thinking. So, for example, you might start this particular game by asking both A and B to answer a question like, "How are you doing today?" And the computer would respond, "I'm feeling fine." B might say, "I'm feeling pretty good." And then you follow up and say, when you woke up this morning, what was the weather like? And computer could presumably go back in its data and say, it was kind of cold and dreary outside, but I'm glad that the sun came out. C could be a little trickier and say, could you calculate a big number for me? Now, what is 1,558 times 72? I'm not able to do that in my head. The computer can do that instantaneously. But of course, if the computer answers much more quickly than the human, that's a giveaway. Part of the job of the computer is to slow down its calculations, or maybe even make mistakes in a calculation in a way that will deceive the human. They're trying to imitate humans both in the positive sense, but also in a somewhat negative sense, replicating the faults of human behavior. Should computers be trying to imitate human beings to the extent of even replicating their faults? Turing said if a computer could pass this test, it could be considered intelligent, but he also then discussed several objections to that idea. I won't go through all of these, but a lot of the paper is dedicated to these objections. For example, the theological objection. The question here is, do computers have a soul? He asked back to the imaginary interlocutor, well, how do we understand a soul? If you can explain to me what a soul is in a human being, then we'll be able to decide whether a computer could think with or without that soul. And of course, it's a good response because if you read the theological literature on what it means to have a soul, you'll find the diversity of opinion. There's no settled point of view. People had what he called a heads in the sand objection, which is that computers will never get to the point where they could actually pass a test like this. In 1947, that was a reasonable objection. There weren't computers back then that could actually perform natural language responses in the way that would fool human beings. And so it might have seemed impossible to the casual observer that we'd ever get to that point. But, fast forward to 2020, and I think you'd see that it's actually quite possible. And we'll see some examples later on in this class about computers that really respond very naturally. So the heads in the sand objection seems less plausible than it once was. I want to just highlight a couple others. Number 6 is Lady Lovelace's objection. This is a reference to Ada Lovelace, who some people call her the first computer programmer. She basically argued that computers couldn't do anything original. The idea is that whatever you put into a computer in terms of the program is what you'll get out. And so there's no room for a kind of leap of creativity. You're essentially going to have a mechanical outcome, even if it seems like a surprising outcome. If you look at all the pieces that went into it, you'd see that it was programmed from the very beginning to have that kind of output. That objection is a very reasonable one, and when I teach this in classes, students really resonate with it. But then, I ask them to consider their favorite video games and about surprising events that happen in those games. It sometimes strikes the game was a sentient entity capable of doing surprising things. But they've gotten so complex that we can't decide from looking at the source code what their behavior will be. Perhaps we've overcome Lady Lovelace's objection. The last one that I really like to highlight is this argument from extrasensory perception. This is a funny one. Basically, what Turing said is, if there's a way to go to detect just by ESP that you're in conversation with a human, even if you can't see that human, you can sort of detect through extrasensory perception that the person on the other side is human rather than a machine. We might know through this other hidden means that we're talking with a human even when we're only receiving written messages through a portal. It's the kind of sixth sense that sometimes people feel when someone's looking at you in the back of the neck and you turn around and someone's staring at you. Turing was willing to give that some credibility and say if human beings were shown to have that type of power, then the imitation game wouldn't work. We'll just leave it there. I don't know if believing that machines can think is any less of a stretch of the imagination to thinking that we have ESP. This idea of computers producing human-like output captivated computer scientists and the general public. When I was growing up, there was this book that my father bought, which I really enjoyed reading, called The Policeman's Beard is Half Constructed, a program called Ractor. It came up with poetry on its own. Some of the poetry was quite striking and original. This was in the 1980s, and so you see this idea of using computers to generate textual works, or what's called natural language processing, has been around for a while. The works generated by computers are becoming more and more sophisticated to the point that they can trick humans. You could think this is almost like a kind of imitation game writ large. A program written by some MIT students called SciGen can create an academic paper out of whole cloth. Put in a title, names, and it will generate an article that, if you read it at a superficial level, looks quite like an academic paper. Of course, if you read it carefully, it basically adds up to nothing. But these papers generated by SciGen have actually gotten into academic conferences through the peer review process, which is a bit of an embarrassment to the academics maintaining those peer review processes. So students were able to write generators that would create papers that could fool experts. And this is just going to continue to grow as programs for generating text become increasingly sophisticated. One of the questions I have for us is whether we'll ever have a sermon generator. So when you've got a pastor sort of sweating it out on Saturday night trying to write a sermon, could we turn to a computer program and have that computer write a sermon for us that would be plausible and appropriate for the congregation? We'll come back to this in a moment, but the reason I have these two photos here is it just harkens to a phrase that Karl Barth is credited with saying, which is that a pastor should preach with the Bible in the one hand and the newspaper in the other, connecting the biblical message to current events. The question is, could we develop an algorithm that would produce sermons that synthesized the biblical message with current concerns reflected in journalistic sources? But we'll come back to that, and we'll see if that's possible. The Turing test was basically a test to see if a computer could fool a human into thinking it was human. But we might say that's not really the best test. Maybe rather than trying to fool a human, a better way would be for a human and a computer to begin interacting with empathy and understanding that might lead to a real friendship. Maybe that's a better way of thinking about intelligence. Can it lead to friendship rather than can it fool someone into thinking? Stephanie Dinkins, an artist, has been trying exactly that method with a computer known as Bina 48. You see Bina 48 in the foreground. Her goal is to become friends with Bina 48. It's a challenging friendship in the sense that Bina 48 doesn't always respond as a human being would to questions. What's fascinating is Dinkins' attempt to nevertheless bridge that gap and see if there could be a level of common understanding. And it really does at times result in quite interesting interchanges that show a surprising level of perspicacity. I'd encourage you to watch some of those videos. Another question that we might think about then is, what's the best way for machines to learn? Should they learn by writing a whole bunch of rules? We try to codify all human behavior and then apply those rules through computer programs to see if machines can imitate the implicit rules in our social behaviors? Or should computers learn like little children do, in the sense that they come into situations and gather from experiences what the rules are? These are different paradigms for teaching. They're not necessarily contradictory, but they can be quite different in the approach. You might think about letting machines evolve as really sophisticated Tamagotchi. I don't know if you remember these. They were like the big rage in the 80s. You would raise a little computer that you would carry around in your pocket, and you'd have to feed it from time to time and care for it. And if you didn't, then it would become sick. Ted Chiang has a short story that he calls The Life Cycle of Software Objects, in which he imagines what it would be like if we could do this on a scale in which little AIs would grow up and we would train them and interact with them and feed and care for them. What would be the outcome of that? It's a great short story, and I encourage you to look at it if you're interested in thinking about that paradigm for raising artificial intelligence. We raise children who, when they are babies, can only interact with us on a fairly limited level, but then are full-fledged human beings. How do they learn so much in that short period of time? Is it possible for AIs to experience a similar learning process, perhaps even an accelerated one? Okay, so before we end, I actually want to stop the slideshow and just come to a few of the things that I talked about along the way. So here's the site where we could generate our random paper. As I said, this was an early approach. This goes back 15 years. The new approaches that have come into existence are really based on something called deep learning. These are techniques in which software develop models that take into account that we speak to each other on the internet and then try to anticipate based on prompts what would likely be the case that would be said next based on what was said previously. So let's try this out in practice. This is a site called Talk to Transformer. It's based on a language model released last year by OpenAI, which is called GPT-2. And you'll see that it's able to craft really interesting paragraphs based on prompts. Let's go to the Bible Gateway and let's say greatest commandment. And we'll take that from the New Revised Standard Version. Okay, and so here is Matthew 22, 36 through 40. And so we'll say, Teacher, which commandment of the law is the greatest? I'm going to take that and put it as an input into Talk to Transformer. And we're going to ask Talk to Transformer to complete that text for us. Okay, so this is quite interesting. It's basically giving us a kind of like midrash on the phrase. So, teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? Thou shalt not murder. Talmud, Aruch, chapter 3, page 25. And then, if a man assaults another and he kills him, he is committing murder. Maimonides in his Mishnah Torah. As murder is prohibited by the law, they did not realize that one could not commit murder without violence. If we look at murder in the Old Testament, we see the accepted interpretation of the Hebrew term, and so on and so on. If we generate it again, we'll have a completely different output. And so here we've moved into a Christian context. This, in fact, looks quite like the biblical context. We'd have to go back and see if this matches up with Matthew, but from a first read, it looks very, very similar. So let's try it again. And here we get something quite different. Sometimes it gets stuck in these kind of loops, basically repeating the same thing over and over again. So that wasn't as successful. I'd encourage you to try this out and give it your own prompts and sort of see what it comes up with. Now, this has also been used for games. This is a game that you might want to check out. It's called AI Dungeon. And so if we click on this, you can see that this uses GPT-2 behind the scenes, but it's turned it into a game. So we enter into this, and then we pick a setting. And so in this particular one, I'm going to say custom. And I'm just going to pass back that teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest. Let's see how that works out. So then it starts off, teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest, the first and most important of them all? I'm not a priest, you exclaim. How can I know what is right and wrong? Teacher, please explain the law to me. You're not a priest, so you don't have any idea how to interpret the laws of this world. What do you mean, you ask? It's simple, he says. Let's just ask for a little bit more along those lines. If you want something done right, then you must do it yourself. If you want something done wrong, then someone else will do it for you. But what about salvation? How can it be achieved? But if I want to go back home, how am I going to get there? He shrugs his shoulders. So you can see that it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I'd encourage you to try playing this because it's a game that, again, uses the ideas behind GPT-2 and uses the models that are developed to create situations which can go in infinite many directions, and it's helped you to understand the possibilities of text generation. Finally, I want to bring us around to how you can actually use this yourself. This is a Google Colab notebook. This is a Python program that's running here. And what I've done in this program is to combine the Bible and the newspaper. So here I'm using a package called TensorFlow, which is a machine learning framework. I've downloaded that language model called GPT-2. This is a very simple version of it. The full version is much, much larger, but this should do for the time being. And then I've gone to the web and I've gotten a full King James Bible, and I've downloaded that here. And then I've gone and I've gotten a bunch of news articles. So you can see here that here are the titles of the articles. Man dies after being bitten by a shark near the Great Barrier Reef. Great Barrier Reef suffers third mass bleaching event in 5 years. Cardinal George Bell freed from prison after High Court overturned sex abuse conviction, and so on and so on and so on. There are about 1,000 articles here. I think 1,007 articles. And then what I thought I would do is combine the King James Version with the news and ask GPT-2 based on those biblical inputs as well as the news article to come up with some text. Now, this is all, in a way, just a farce because, you're not going to expect it to produce anything that really makes sense from these two very different sources. But, over time, will we see something like this? I don't know. So here it is training this model and coming up with some samples. Let's go down and see what the samples look like now that it's trained. You can see here that right now it's saying things that don't seem like the Bible or like the news. So we're not alone. Hundreds of thousands of people have already found jobs through temporary work visas, but that's not the end of the journey. It's the start of the end of that journey. Whether that reflects the Bible or the news, I don't know. But it is interesting to think that at some point in the future, we may be able to ask machines to do the type of preaching that Karl Barth said. Will computers ever guide us to the point where they can help us to become better preachers? I don't know. It's something that we'll look into in future weeks, but at least I hope this gave you an overview of the kind of things that are happening around artificial intelligence that may not lead to computers thinking, but may be indicative of them becoming better and better imitators of human behavior. I'll leave it at that and look forward to joining with you next time. If you have any questions in the meantime, please send them my way and I'd be happy to incorporate them into my next lesson. Thanks a lot. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.